It was the kind of Thursday that felt invisible. No drama, no rush, no warning. The kind of day that slips between the cracks of memory because it's just fine. Helen Morgan had woken up before her alarm again. The house was quiet, save for the occasional creak of old wood and the low murmur of the radio playing in the background. The kettle hissed, toast popped up. The world, for once, felt gentle. She poured herself a cup of coffee and leaned against the counter, mug warm in her hands. The scent of oat milk and cinnamon drifted upward. Across the table sat Hila's half-eaten banana and her usual mess of notebooks, one of which still had a sticky note on it that read, "Don't forget to smile, it scares people." That made Helen chuckle. It was a moment. Ordinary, intimate. A snapshot of a life in motion. She rinsed the mug absent-mindedly, staring out the window as cars drifted by. Just another Thursday. Just another page in the week. And then the phone rang. At first, she didn't flinch, just reached for it like always with one hand still wet from the sink. "Hello?" A pause. "Is this Helen Morgan?" "Yes, it is." "This is County Medical. Your daughter Hila, she's been in a car accident. She's at our emergency department. We need you to come immediately." For a full 2 seconds, Helen said nothing. Then, "Hila? What? Is she?" "She's stable, ma'am, but you need to come now." That word, stable, it should have been comforting. But it wasn't. It sounded like a code, like a warning dressed in a white coat. Helen's heart dropped. The mug slipped from her hand and clattered into the sink, splashing water everywhere. She didn't wipe it. She didn't grab her coat. She didn't even lock the door. All she knew was this Thursday had ended, and something much darker had just begun. The drive to the hospital was a blur. Helen didn't remember the traffic lights or the turns she made. Her hands were clenched around the steering wheel knuckles, white as if squeezing tighter might somehow rewind time. By the time she reached the ER, her chest was tight, her eyes dry, her thoughts spinning. She was taken back almost immediately. A doctor in scrubs met her in the hallway, calm, professional expression unreadable. "Are you Isla Morgan's mother?" "Yes," she said breathlessly. "She's stable," the doctor nodded. "Conscious, responsive." Helen exhaled finally, only to suck the air right back in as he continued. "But she has a fractured spine. There's internal swelling around the vertebrae, and it's time-sensitive." Fractured spine, internal swelling, time-sensitive? The words looped in her head like a siren. She couldn't speak, could barely breathe. The doctor led her to a small room with a screen. On it, there were scans black and white and terrifying. Bones, tissue, danger. "There are 2 options," he said, pointing to one side of the screen. "Option A is a newer precision-guided procedure with a 98% success rate. Minimal risk of nerve damage. No long-term impact if we act fast." Helen nodded, trying to stay upright. "Option B," he continued, "is the standard surgery, covered by insurance, but it comes with a significantly higher risk, especially of permanent damage, including paralysis." There was a beat of silence. Just long enough for the words to settle in her bloodstream. "We'll go with option A," Helen said immediately. The doctor paused. "Are you sure? It's significantly more expensive." Helen didn't even blink. "I'm sure." He nodded. "We'll need a financial decision by tonight. The optimal surgery window is less than 24 hours. "Then we'll make it happen," Helen said, even as her stomach twisted into knots. She didn't know how she'd find the money. But one thing was crystal clear. She was not going to gamble with her daughter's spine. Helen didn't sleep that night. She sat in the dim waiting room, lit only by the flicker of a vending machine screen and the soft hum of fluorescent lights overhead. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Isla, her baby girl, lying on that gurney, wires in her arms, eyes dazed, fighting pain she never should have known at 18. There was no debate in Helen's mind. She had made her decision the moment the doctor said 98% success rate. Hila deserved the best. She wasn't settling for good enough. not when it came to her child's future. But when the finance department handed her the estimate, Helen's heart hit the floor. $38,450. Due tomorrow. Not the whole surgery, just the portion not covered by insurance. Helen stared at the paper. Her fingers shook. This wasn't sell your TV money. This was sign your soul money. She drained her savings during the flu season 2 years ago, took on a second job to stay afloat. There was nothing left to pull from. Her breath caught in her throat. She had one option left, one she swore she'd never take. She opened her phone, scrolled past every old contact, past coworkers, friends, until her thumb hovered over one name, Dad, Richard Morgan, then the other, Mom, Claire Morgan. She froze. Calling them meant exposure, vulnerability, shame. But Isla was lying in a hospital bed, spine fractured, time ticking. Helen exhaled slowly and pressed call. The phone rang. Once, twice, 3 times. Helen's pulse pounded in her ears as she held the phone against her cheek. It was nearly 6:45 p.m., dinner time. She knew they'd pick up. They always picked up. Click. "Hey, kiddo," came her dad's familiar voice, warm, casual, like nothing in the world was wrong. Helen forced a breath. "Dad, it's Isla. She was in a car accident." "She's okay, but she needs spinal surgery, a specialized one. It's not covered. I need help financially. Just someone to co-sign a loan." There was a pause, a long one. "Oh, sweetheart," Richard finally said. "Are you sure it's not covered? That seems strange." "I've triple-checked," Helen replied. "There's a cheaper surgery, but it carries much more risk. I'm not comfortable with it." Then another voice came through, her mother, Claire, on speaker. "Did you ask the insurance to appeal the claim? Sometimes they change their mind if you push back." "Mom, this isn't a clerical error," Helen said, her voice tight. "It's a policy gap. They don't cover newer procedures." Silence. "Look," Helen continued, her voice cracking, "I'm not asking you to pay it. I just need your signature, just a cosign so I can secure the rest of the loan." Another pause. Then Richard cleared his throat. "It's just the timing, you know?" Helen froze. "What timing?" "Well, we're leaving Monday. That family resort in Aruba, it's non-refundable past the 7-day mark." Claire chimed in. "Your sister's been looking forward to it for months. The kids, too. We promised them." Helen stared blankly at the hospital wall. "My daughter might be paralyzed." Richard's voice grew defensive. "That's not fair, Helen. You're putting us in an impossible position. It's not that we don't care." "It kind of feels like you don't," she whispered. Helen tightened her grip on the phone. She didn't want to yell. She wanted to believe desperately that this was just a misunderstanding, that surely her parents would come through. "I'm not asking you to cancel the trip," she said carefully. "I'm asking you to co-sign a loan. You don't have to pay a cent." More silence. Then Claire spoke again, soft, sugar-coated. "It's just, we've already paid everything in full. Flights, hotel, excursions. It's a family package, $14,000 total. If we cancel now, we lose everything." Helen closed her eyes. "Ela might end up paralyzed, Mom." There was a beat. Then Richard's voice, harder this time. "You're being unfair, Helen." Her jaw clenched. "Unfair? You're acting like we don't care about Ela." "You said you care," Helen snapped. "But when it came down to choosing between your granddaughter's spine and a poolside cocktail with Megan and her kids, you kicked the cocktail." "That's not fair. Stop saying that," Helen's voice cracked. "You've never treated her like family. Not really. You treat Megan's kids like royalty and mine like a footnote." "That's not true." "Isn't it? You're willing to lose $14,000 for a vacation, but not willing to sign a document to save Isla from a wheelchair?" Richard exhaled loudly. "We're not doctors, Helen. Maybe the cheaper surgery is fine." No, you don't get to do that. You don't get to gamble with her body just so you can sip wine by the ocean. She waited. They said nothing. Not sorry, not even confused, just nothing. Helen didn't go back inside right away. She walked out of the hospital, past the vending machines, past the rows of automatic doors, and sat down on the cold concrete bench outside the entrance. Her phone was still in her hand, screen black, heart heavier than it had ever been. Inside, her daughter lay with a fractured spine. Outside, Helen sat with a fractured soul. Across the sidewalk, something moved. A pigeon, dirty, tired, limping. It dragged one wing behind it, hopping more than walking. Its feathers were ruffled. One eye blinked slowly, as if even blinking hurt. Helen stared at it. She didn't look away. She watched it try to peck at something invisible on the pavement, then stumble sideways, then stop completely still, like even breathing had become too much. And in that moment, Helen asked herself a question she couldn't shake. If this pigeon had parents, would they pay for its surgery? The thought came out of nowhere, but it stuck. Would they sell a vacation? Co-sign a loan? Pause their plans long enough to care? She didn't cry. She just sat there, staring, as the pigeon limped behind a trash can and vanished from view. Helen didn't sleep. Again. Instead, she sat by Isla's hospital bed, watching the steady rhythm of the IV drip, her mind moving faster than her pulse. She had less than 12 hours. No cosigner, no money, and no pride left to protect. So she did something she hadn't done in years. She started calling everyone. Not family, not blood, but everyone else. She started with the mother of one of Isla's old theater classmates. They'd spoken once during intermission over plastic cups of punch. "Hi, this is Helen, Isla's mom. I know this is out of nowhere, but she's in the hospital, and I need help." Before Helen could even finish, the woman said, "What do you need?" Then came the retired teacher who used to smile at Ila's science projects, the barista who once lent Helen her umbrella during a storm, the woman across the street who waved but never really spoke. Each of them gave what they could: $40, $300, a handwritten note, and a bag of snacks, a Venmo transfer with a single word, hope. Helen opened a spreadsheet on her laptop. She wasn't tracking money. She was tracking miracles, and quietly she titled the file, People Who Showed Up. Later, she would rename it The Spreadsheet of Shame, because it wasn't the stranger's generosity that haunted her. It was the fact that her own parents weren't on the list. Helen kept updating the spreadsheet. Every new name, every new donation, no matter how small, got its own line. It wasn't about the money anymore. It was about what the money represented. Each row was like a quiet rebellion. A whispered middle finger tucked neatly in a digital cell. Not loud, not angry, but unmistakably clear. You were wrong about me. You were wrong to leave us. A woman from Isla's violin class dropped off a grocery bag full of snacks, toothpaste, a blanket, and a $50 bill hidden inside a card that read, "Sending light." A man Helen hadn't seen in 10 years transferred $300 and wrote, "You don't owe me a thing. I just remember how kind you were when my wife was sick." Someone else, an old coworker, texted, "I don't have much, but you're not alone," and then sent $20. These weren't grand gestures, they were real ones, and they piled up. Helen sat on the edge of a plastic hospital chair, typing in names one by one. Each keystroke felt like a protest, like justice, soft and slow, but real. She didn't have time for tears, but deep down, something inside her had shifted. Her parents hadn't just failed her, they'd been replaced. The sun hadn't even risen when the nurses rolled Isla toward the surgical wing. Helen walked beside the gurney in silence, her hand wrapped tightly around her daughter's fingers. Isla didn't speak much. Her eyes fluttered half shut. Morphine did its job. But just before the doors swung closed, she whispered, "You stayed." Helen nodded, lips trembling. "I'll always stay." The team took Isla inside. And Helen collapsed into the nearest chair like every ounce of her strength had followed the gurney into that room. The surgery would take hours. She didn't cry, she didn't pray, she stared at the screen on her phone, the donation app, the messages, the spreadsheet like it was oxygen. Every cent had been covered, not by family, not by blood, but by neighbors, teachers, baristas, ex-coworkers, near strangers, people with no obligation but enormous hearts. And from Richard and Claire Morgan, nothing. No call, no text, not even a message that said, "Thinking of you." Helen refreshed her inbox. Still nothing. And that silence, it was louder than any scream. 3 days after Isla's surgery, the call came. Helen was sitting in the hospital cafeteria, stirring cold coffee she hadn't taken a sip of. Her body was there, but her mind still somewhere inside the ICU. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She almost let it go to voicemail until something in her gut whispered, "Pick up." "Hello?" A voice she hadn't heard in years replied, warm but formal. "Helen, this is Greg Larson, Margaret's attorney." Her spine straightened. Greg? Wow, it's been a long time. "I heard about Ayla's accident. I'm so sorry. I know Margaret would have been heartbroken." Helen swallowed. "Thanks. She would have been." A pause. Then Greg said the sentence that knocked the wind out of her. "Did Ayla ever receive her inheritance?" Silence. Helen blinked, confused. What? Her inheritance from Margaret. It was supposed to transfer to her when she turned 18. Helen's stomach flipped. There was an inheritance? Another pause, this one heavy, loaded with disbelief. "Yes," Greg replied, "a substantial one, set aside in a trust. Your parents were named as temporary trustees until Ayla reached adulthood." Helen's blood turned cold. "They never said a word," she whispered. "They never gave her anything." And right there at that plastic table with the stale coffee, Helen realized something far, far worse than being abandoned. They hadn't just refused to help. They'd stolen. Greg's voice stayed calm, but every word he said hit Helen like a punch to the gut. "Margaret set up the trust years ago," he explained. "She didn't want any confusion after she passed. Ayla was the sole beneficiary. Everything, the house, the stocks, her coin collection, was meant to go to her." Helen gripped the edge of the table. "Ayla turned 18 3 months ago," Greg added. "The paperwork should have been filed immediately." "It wasn't," Helen said flatly. Greg sighed. "Then I'm afraid, Helen, this isn't a misunderstanding. This is theft." The word hung in the air like a cold wind. Helen replayed the past year in her mind, and everything clicked. The sudden luxury cruise. The new SUV Megan's kids received with a bow on top. The kitchen remodel her mother had shown off on Facebook with hashtags like #New Year New Counters. The designer bags, the art, the spa weekends, the way they suddenly didn't need her help with the mortgage anymore. They weren't just being careless, they were spending Ayla's future on leather seats, on beachfront photos, on comfort. And they had the audacity to say, "We just can't take the financial risk." Helen felt something in her chest snap. They had let their granddaughter lie in a hospital bed while living off her inheritance? Helen waited until the timing felt right. Not during rounds, not while Ayla was hooked up to wires and IV bags, but later, when the room was quiet, when the machines had stopped beeping, when it was just the two of them and the faint hum of sterile air. "Ayla," Helen said gently, "there's something you need to know." Ayla blinked slow, groggy, still healing. Helen told her everything. The trust, the inheritance, her grandparents, the lies. When she finished, she braced for tears, anger, a scream, something. But Ayla just stared straight ahead, blank, silent. Then finally she spoke, voice calm, too calm. "They said they loved me." Nothing else. Helen waited, but no tears came, no tremble in her lip, no demand for justice, no explosion of rage, just that one sentence, hanging in the air like smoke. They said they loved me. And in that stillness, Helen saw it. Not a breakdown, not heartbreak, but transformation. This wasn't grief anymore. It was something colder, sharper. It was resolve. It didn't start with shouting. It started with signatures. Helen and Isla sat in Greg Larson's office, surrounded by legal pads, manila folders, and quiet fury. The lawsuit was filed within days. Civil court, fiduciary fraud, breach of trust. Greg took the lead. He wasn't just Margaret's lawyer. He was a man with a memory, a man who had seen the way Margaret used to light up when she talked about Isla, a man who cared. "Your parents will fight back," he warned gently. Helen nodded. Let them. And fight back they did. Richard and Claire Morgan, once the respectable retirees, suddenly became defendants. They hired a high-priced attorney who walked into court with a Rolex, a rehearsed smirk, and a defense that made jaws clench. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, "we believe Margaret Morgan was of questionable mental clarity at the time she drafted that will." Helen's fists tightened in her lap. That was their strategy. Not denial, not remorse, but character assassination. "She was confused," the lawyer continued. "She was nearing 90. Memory fades. Perhaps she didn't understand what she was signing." Greg rose calmly. "We'll see about that." The war had begun. And this time, Helen wasn't the one who had to beg. She was the one being heard. Greg didn't raise his voice. He didn't need to. He let the documents speak for him. On the second day of trial, he stood before the court with a calmness that only comes from knowing you're holding the truth. "Your Honor," he began, "my client's grandmother, Margaret Morgan, was not only of sound mind, she was deliberate." He held up a notarized copy of the will, dated, witnessed, sealed. He placed it on the table. Then came the email printouts. "Here's a message she sent me 6 months before her passing. Subject line, finalizing Isla's future." He read it aloud. "Isla is the only one who listens when I talk about compound interest. That alone deserves a fortune." The courtroom shifted. Even the opposing lawyer looked uncomfortable. But Greg wasn't done. He slid forward a thick stack of paper bank statements. Dates, withdrawals, deposits, all showing a clear and steady misuse of funds after the date of Margaret's death. Spa weekends, a kitchen remodel, a brand new SUV, none of which benefited the rightful heir. Richard shifted in his seat. Claire looked down. Helen didn't blink. And Isla, she smiled, just slightly, because for the first time, someone had stood up and said, "You mattered. You were never invisible. You were always the one." It didn't come with a bang. It came with a stamp. The judge leaned forward, voice firm but measured. "This court finds Richard and Claire Morgan in breach of fiduciary duty. All assets under their control are to be returned to the rightful beneficiary, Isla Morgan." The gavel struck once, not loud, but it echoed like a thunderclap in the silence. Greg didn't smile. Helen didn't speak. Isla exhaled. That was it, just a breath. But it sounded like the sound of a house collapsing, and in a way, it was. Because within a week, the family home went on the market. The SUV was repossessed, the art collection was seized, the retirement account was frozen, the so-called vacation property in Santorini, gone. All of it, gone. Richard and Claire moved into a 2-bedroom rental near the freeway, the kind of place where windows don't shut right and the air smells like gasoline. Old friends stopped returning calls. Extended family unfriended them quietly. Neighbors stared but didn't wave. Because word gets around, especially when it's true. And now, the people who once sipped champagne by the beach were boiling pasta on a hot plate beside a broken window. The verdict was clear. The consequences were real. The silence from Richard and Claire still chilling. Even after losing everything, the house, the car, the vacations, the reputation, they never said sorry, not once. In fact, the first words Helen heard from her mother after the ruling weren't, "I'm sorry." They were, "You've torn this family apart!" Helen didn't flinch. She didn't answer. Because what do you say to someone who still thinks you're survival? Claire went on. "You've humiliated us, publicly. Is that what you wanted?" Richard added. "You've poisoned Isla against us. She used to love us." Helen finally spoke. Calm, precise. She still might have if you had chosen her instead of your comfort. They didn't respond, just stood there. No apology, no remorse. Only resentment. But what they didn't know was that the civil case wasn't the end, because in the background, Greg had been preparing something else, something bigger, criminal charges. You'd think after losing everything they'd stop, but some people can't let go of control. 2 weeks after the verdict, Greg was reviewing leftover financial trails, just tying up loose ends, until something flagged, a small wire transfer, then another, then 5 more. Each one small enough to seem invisible, each one going to the same account, under the name of Megan Holmes, Helen's younger sister. Greg stared at the screen. "Unbelievable," he whispered. They weren't done stealing. They were still trying to hide money, still manipulating, still moving. He picked up the phone and called Helen. "They set up another account under your sister's name." "Helen? So that's why Megan's been posting photos in Florence." Greg didn't hesitate. "We're filing again, not just for contempt of court, but for criminal concealment of assets, fraud, conspiracy, obstruction." The Morgans hadn't just lost their house. Now they were going to lose their freedom. It didn't feel like justice. It felt necessary. Richard and Claire Morgan were sentenced to 4 years and 8 months in federal prison for fraud, concealment of inheritance, and obstruction of justice. And this time, there were no lawyers to stall, no more assets to sell, no luxury cruises to run to, only a cold courtroom, and 2 pairs of handcuffs. They were let out wearing orange, not designer, not pressed linen, just standard issue scratchy polyester. The courtroom was quiet, not because people were stunned, but because no one cared to object. No one from their family cried. No one shouted in protest. Even Megan, the one who benefited from the hidden accounts, sat in the back looking down. Helen watched without blinking. Isla, she didn't look at them at all. Not out of cruelty, but because they no longer occupied space in her future. As the door closed behind the Morgans, it sounded like a vault being sealed, and the message was clear. No more champagne, no more cruises, no more pretending. The money came back. Not all of it, but enough to make a difference. Enough to tempt revenge, to splurge, to prove something. But Isla didn't spend a dime on herself. No designer bags, no champagne dinners, no TikTok showing off. Instead, she walked into a small, quiet bank, opened a modest account, and named it the Compound Project, a nod to her grandmother, who once told her, "Compound interest isn't just financial, Isla. Kindness grows the same way." The project would help single mothers, teen girls in crisis, people whose families had failed them. Because Isla knew something now. Justice doesn't always come crashing down. Sometimes it grows quietly, like interest, like roots. "I don't hate them," Isla said, "but I'll never forgive them." Helen looked at her daughters surprised, not because of the words, but because there were no tears behind them, just steel. "They didn't just steal money," Isla continued. "They risked my life. They made me beg for it, and then they watched." Greg had asked if she wanted to proceed with criminal charges. She could have said no. She could have moved on. She could have pretended healing meant forgetting. But Isla shook her head. "File it, Greg, because justice isn't about comfort. It's not about peace. It's about accountability. Some people don't deserve to be let off gently. And Isla, she wasn't a little girl anymore. In a quiet room at Greg's law office, Isla sat alone with the paperwork. No cameras, no dramatic music. Just the soft scratch of a pen. At the very end of the victim statement form, there was a blank line labeled, "Final words if any." Isla didn't hesitate. She wrote, "Some people don't deserve forgiveness, just consequences." She slid the paper forward. No mic drop, no applause, just closure. As the screen fades to black, a single voiceover lingers. Too far, or just far enough. Not all families are built on love, and not all strangers are distant. Sometimes the people who share your blood will walk away when you need them most, and sometimes those who owe you nothing will show up when no one else does. Justice doesn't always come wrapped in applause. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it takes the shape of consequences. You don't have to forgive the unforgivable, but you do have to protect yourself. And sometimes the best revenge is healing louder than their betrayal. If this story moved something in you, if you've ever been betrayed, overlooked, or told to just let it go, subscribe to our channel. Because here, we don't just tell stories, we stand up for the people inside them. Tap that red button, hit the bell, and tell us in the comments, do you think Isla went too far or just far enough?